Hello, this is Dave Shestokas. I'm the author of Constitutional Soundbites, and this is the third episode that we are putting together thanks to the good graces of SAT Media and Josh Alvarado and his team. And unfortunately, the last couple of sessions that we've had the opportunity to be together, I've been here with Matt Skitza, and Matt, unfortunately, is a bit under the weather today, and so we're going to do this kind of solo and kind of not. Josh is off screen, and from time to time he may interject something or ask a question if I say something that sounds maybe too much like a lawyer, in which case Josh will be kind of like playing the role of my mom, who's the one that kind of puts me back in place when when I'm done writing, and mom is the one that says it sounds too much like a lawyer. And Constitutional Soundbites has got 150 questions and answers, primarily, of course, associated with the Constitution of the United States of America. First, for the introduction in the first two episodes, we went through some of the first group of questions. Those questions developed out of when I was doing a radio show, and that radio show was called Constitutionally Speaking, and we would do a minute of Constitutionally Speaking as promos for that show that was on the air in primarily Southwest Florida, the Tampa area, when I was living there, and I was also practicing law in Florida. So the book developed out of those, and so now we're going to go through this. Recently, I was in an organization called We the People of McHenry County, Illinois, and one of the topics that came up was some of the writings of David Barton. And David Barton has a constitutional class that I would recommend to anybody to find and follow through on. There's other things put on by Heritage and a variety of things. What else comes to mind? The College, Hillsdale College, and so there's a lot of material that people can look to and find. Everybody has a little bit different take. We've got some interesting things that I'd like to think about, and so we finished last time talking about Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas of 1776. And without Washington crossing the Delaware in the Christmas of 1776, it's very unlikely there would have ever been the United States of America. And so that may sound like that bit of history might be unrelated to the Constitution, but unless those guys did that day and traipsed about 7 or 8 hours up the Delaware River into Trenton, where they defeated the Hessian army that had been hired by the British through a surprise attack, it's very likely we would not have a Constitution in the United States of America. So those are important things too. It's one thing just to read the Constitution, know the technical stuff involved, but almost everything that's in the Constitution has some sort of story behind it. And so we're going to talk about some of those today and some of the other situations. And so there's 150 questions, and one of the questions that's in the book after the story of crossing the Delaware in the Christmas of 1776 might not sound like an important one, but strangely enough, it has an impact on our history. And the next question was, how long after independence was declared through the Declaration of Independence was in fact the Constitution in effect? And the Declaration of Independence was finished up and issued, of course, on July 4th, 1776. A lot of things happened in the interim before we ever got to the Constitution, not the least of which, of course, was the war for the Revolution. And then in the early days of the country, there was something called the Articles of Confederation that got put together originally in 1777 and wasn't really completely ratified by all the states until about 1783. So it kind of lingered on and went for a while. But generally speaking, the idea of the Articles of Confederation was a loose group of independent nations more than a single country, and so they wanted to overcome that problem, and they didn't have, but they wanted to create a stronger federal government, but they still did not want to impinge on our freedoms, on their freedoms, the things that they had fought the revolution for. So It was actually 1776 that they declared independence. It was not until May of 1787 that the Constitutional Convention would meet, and then they worked for 5 months till September 17th, 1787, to in fact draft up and put together the Constitution of the United States of America. So it was September 17th, and for those of you who don't know, because we don't teach these things, I'm not holding anything against anybody, but we don't teach these things. The fact is that September 17th is considered to be Constitution Day in recognition of that being the day that they finished the Constitution and sent it out to the states for ratification. And so that's an important day to note, but it would be 2 more years until 1789 that the Constitution actually went into effect, meaning that it was actually 13 years after the Declaration of Independence before we actually had the United States Constitution that we were operating under. And organizing things for 13 years when it was a brand new country, brand new concept of people ruling themselves. I would suggest to you that it was a interesting 13 years at the least, and people very seldom look at that portion of our history, but some great things happened there, not just the drafting of the Constitution. During the course of that time, the Northwest Ordinance was created, and the Northwest Ordinance would in fact carve out what some of the territory that was given to the new country as a part of the settlement of the Revolution. And the interesting thing, I bring up the Northwest Ordinance now because the original drafter of the Northwest Ordinance was in fact Thomas Jefferson, and the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in all the new territories. It banned slavery in the territories that would ultimately become Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota, and Michigan. And that would have long-term impact because, of course, those would be the free states that would ultimately provide the resources for the Union to be victorious in the Civil War, leading to the abolition of slavery. So when they talk about the Founding Fathers not being a bunch of rich old white guys and slave owners, any number of them were not just that, but even under those circumstances, they knew that slavery was incompatible with the country that they were setting up. And when they had this new territory that was provided through their settlement, they banned slavery in those new territories right from the get-go. And I think that's an important thing for people to know, so that when you hear things about like the 1619 Project, and the folks in the 1619 Project say that the Revolution was fought for the preservation of slavery, take a look. Go read the Northwest Ordinance that put slavery out of business in the new territories that were acquired from England as part of the settlement of the Revolutionary War. Even the guys that everybody says are the rich old white guys that were slave owners, they were among the folks that put in motion the abolition of slavery. So it was 13 years, and that happened during that 13-year period. So, I catch my breath a little bit. Anything interesting there, Josh?
I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Articles of Confederation, right? Right, because that's what we had before the Constitution, right? So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, I'd love to hear that.
Sure, we'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the Articles of Confederation, which it was very curious. It was very difficult to operate a government under the Articles of Confederation because it was considered it didn't really create a country. It created like a League of Nations, right? If you think more like the United Nations circumstance that was created under the Articles. And while there were 13 independent states signatories to the Articles of Confederation, the government of the Articles of Confederation was unable to act without unanimous approval. So and largely, more often than not, when they wanted to get something done, Rhode Island would say no. And so that became that
makes sense.
Yeah, that became problematic with Virginia and some of the larger places, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, had all committed to this unanimous operation of the government, and so essentially the government under the Articles of Confederation pretty much ground to a halt. Basically because of Rhode Island, more often than not, because Rhode Island was always afraid of the big states. you know, and so that was one of the major problems. There was no actually taxing authority under the Articles of Confederation. The way the central government was being run under the Articles of Confederation was through voluntary contributions by the states. It was sort of a voluntary assessment. They'd sort of assess things, but they had no enforcement mechanism to see to it that they actually could collect these taxes or these contributions. So they were consistently out of money. They were unable to pay pensions that were promised to the revolutionary soldiers. And we'll talk about that somewhere down the line, because the revolutionary soldiers at one point in time were not getting paid their pensions, and they wound up surrounding and threatening the Congress for their pensions. And that's why we have the District of Columbia. We're going to get into that somewhere along the line during this.
You know, I can understand that. You know, I know for myself, I would be very upset if I did not, if they decided to not pay my pension.
Sure, you're a veteran. You're a veteran. You served the country. You preserved, protected, and defended the Constitution. And at that point, they preserved, protected the independence of the new country, and they weren't getting their pensions. Yeah. And so this was one of the problems as well with the Articles, because the Articles didn't have any actual mechanism for the central government to make good on its debts. And so there was a lot of complicating factors, and that's one of the reasons why these guys got together. Another little interesting thing, to deal with some of these issues and the inability of the central government under the Articles to take action, they actually proposed this Constitutional Convention to propose amendments to the Articles to re-establish the Articles. And the guys got together in 1787 in Philadelphia, what we now know as Independence Hall. They got together, and rather than propose the amendments, they said, let's junk this, and they wrote a whole new Constitution. Their actual charge in the first place was to amend the Articles. And Franklin and Madison and those guys said, these Articles are so bad, we're gonna just propose that we junk them. And when they junked them, one of the interesting things about that is they needed to overcome the issues of unanimity that had been required. And so, of course, to put the Constitution into effect, they required 9 of the 13 states to ratify it for it to go into effect. So immediately, they went away from the unanimous approval of all the states when the Constitution would take effect. And ultimately, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the Constitution in early 1789, and that's when it went into effect. And so it actually started March 4th, 1789 was the first time that new Congress was convened under the Constitution. So it was a couple of years after they finished up in 1787, and so it was an interesting period of time because theoretically we had 2 governments kind of operating at that period of time, the guys that were operating the Articles, and then the folks that had already ratified and approved the Constitution. And it's always an interesting legal question because the Constitution itself only called for 9 states to put it into effect, but the Articles were still in effect and required unanimity. So it really is an interesting legal question whether the Articles ever went out of effect because it was never a unanimous approval to get rid of them.
Okay.
So, but these guys understood that, and that's what happened. They weren't working. The government was too weak, and of course they were afraid of a strong central government. They were afraid of having standing armies. They were, concerned about all of the kinds of things that, some of which they're afraid of big government. Some of the situations that we're trying to deal with now, how the government has morphed into things that the founders were afraid of, that they tried to protect from. And that's why the Articles were so weak, was to see to it that the central government was not in a position. There was always a thought that if there was a strong standing army, the strong standing army, in addition to the ability to defend the country, would also have the ability to interfere with the freedoms of the citizens.
Right.
And of course now we have these 3 or 4 million federal employees with these various alphabet soup of agencies that are in fact among the things that the founders were afraid of. And so we're going to, but I think people, for them to understand why we're afraid of or understand the problems with these various agencies, they need to know our history. They need to know why this was considered a problem originally and how, and eventually how it is that we got away from that. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, a little bit about the articles and those problems. So we're going to try and explain along the way. We're going to try and get away with how we do it. The next question in the book actually has to do with separation of powers, and one of the issues with the articles themselves is that there was only a legislature, there wasn't an actual executive, and there wasn't even a judiciary. And so they had, again, no enforcement mechanisms for the laws that they passed. They'd get together, they'd pass a law, and everybody go, wow, that's nice. And so they didn't really have an ability to do that. And so they wanted to overcome that, but they didn't want us to be in a situation where we're going to lose our freedom based on that government, because of course they fought the war for the freedom. So they're in an unusual and anomalous position. They needed a government that could operate, but they wanted a government that didn't become like King George. And in some respects, we are now operating under circumstances of like King George. One of the things in my other book, Creating the Declaration of Independence, we talk about how Jefferson opened, how the beginning phrase of the Declaration of Independence is "when in the course of human events." Jefferson originally drafted this up and said "whereas," but then decided that "whereas" is a decree or a mandate from a royal individual, royal body, that is, i.e. the king. And Jefferson said to himself, he said, we're overthrowing a king. We're announcing that we're overthrowing a king. We cannot start having our new government act kingly. Right. And so at the very first day, they got rid of the whereas statements in the Declaration of Independence, and which is very curious. If I would encourage folks to look up the issue, the mandate or the order from both Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle in Cook County and Chicago regarding their vaccination passport situations in Cook County and the city of Chicago. And both Lori Lightfoot and Tony Preckwinkle constructed orders that start as "whereas." And that's what we want. That's what we fought the war to be away from, that simple term, "whereas," because in American law, there is no concept, there isn't anything in American law that allows for a mandate to the people generally. I just always want to catch myself when I say that. There is a principle, there is a place in American law that says a higher court, say the Supreme Court, can issue a mandate to a lower court, where the lower court has to follow the order of the higher court. That's the only place that the term mandate appears, and in American law it has an actual meaning. Mandate has no meaning otherwise, and mandates start with the term "whereas," and we got rid of that in the Declaration of Independence. And so I think that's probably where we're going to go. We're going to get into separation of powers when we come back for episode 4 of Constitutional Soundbites. We look forward to joining you there. Hopefully in a couple more episodes we'll get Matt back, but for the time being we're going to do a couple episodes, me and Josh off screen, if Josh can ever get a word in edgewise. So thanks very much. Well, thanks for coming and watching us on Constitutional Soundbites today.